They thought he was just another quiet 45-year-old passing through town. A man in a worn, brown leather jacket sitting alone in a roadside diner, his German shepherd resting calmly at his feet. No one noticed the way his eyes tracked every movement. No one questioned why the dog never blinked. So when corrupt cops decided to humiliate him spilling hot coffee, mocking his silence, threatening his dog, they expected fear. They expected submission. What they didn't know was that this man didn't leave towns like this. He stayed. And staying would cost them everything. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Winter pressed down on the town with a dull, metallic, cold old snow crusted along curbs and roofs, while a low sky trapped the smell of ice and exhaust. Ethan Cole stepped into the roadside diner just after dawn, 45 years old, broad-shouldered without bulk, his posture carrying the quiet weight of someone who had learned long ago how to occupy space without inviting attention. He wore a dark brown leather jacket scarred by time, and used the collar softened and cracked at the edges, a red and navy flannel visible beneath it, faded silvered jeans that had known hard miles, cold weather leather boots laced tight, and a gray wool scarf wrapped once around his neck, like a habit he hadn't questioned in years. His hair was dark, with threads of gray at the temples, cut short for convenience rather than style, and a trimmed beard outlined a jaw set with angles sharpened by discipline and restraint. His eyes were pale and steady, the kind that measured rooms by reflections and exits without making a show of it. He chose a corner booth by instinct back to the wall and slid in with a controlled ease, resting one hand on the table, while the other dropped briefly beneath it to touch the head of Max, his German shepherd. Max was a large adult male with a thick black and tan coat and amber eyes, his build powerful but lean movements, economical, lying under the table with his body aligned parallel to Ethan's legs. Chin near Ethan's boot, ears half-cocked to the room. At 4 years old, he carried himself with the calm precision of training, reinforced by trust, a dog who understood silence as a language. The diner smelled of coffee and grease, and lemon cleaner, a familiar working-class blend, and the early crowd kept their voices low, a habit born from long practice rather than courtesy. Sarah moved between tables with a practiced sway, a woman in her early 40s with chestnut hair pulled into a loose ponytail, freckles dusting her pale skin, and a tired kindness etched into her face. She was tall and slim, her posture resilient in a way that suggested years of balancing grace and endurance, and she smiled with her eyes. First, the smile of someone who still tried to believe people could be decent. She poured Ethan coffee without asking, set a bowl of water near Max, and murmured a greeting that carried warmth and caution in equal measure, as if friendliness itself required risk assessment here. Ethan nodded his thanks, his voice low, and even when he replied, careful not to draw attention, his hand resting on the mug as steam curled toward his face, and then faded. The bell over the door jangled hard a few minutes later, metal on glass too loud for the hour, and conversation thinned to a brittle hush as Officer Brian Huxley entered, with 2 deputies in tow. Huxley was in his late 40s, thick through the neck and shoulders, his uniform strained across a heavy frame. Face ruddy from cold and indulgence, eyes small and restless with a practiced confidence that came from knowing no one would challenge him. His hair was cropped too short and receding his jaw clean-shaven to a shine that looked deliberate, and his smile arrived without warmth, a grin that measured what it could take. The deputies flanking him were both adults, younger and eager, their expressions split between nervous amusement and obedience, boots tracking slush across the floor, as if the rules bent for them by default. Huxley laughed loudly, made a comment about the heat inside, and didn't glance at a menu or the counter already claiming the space by the way he stood and scanned for reactions. His gaze found Ethan's booth and lingered, catching the line of Max's back beneath the table, and something bored and mean flickered behind his eyes. He drifted closer with a paper cup of coffee in hand, the lid loose posture careless in a way that was too precise to be accidental. And as he passed the booth, he stumbled just enough to tip the cup. Hot coffee splashed onto the linoleum inches from Max's paws, steam rising sharp and acrid. Max flinched, muscles tightening, a low breath drawn through his nose. But he did not move or growl, his training holding him in place, eyes lifting briefly to Ethan's face. The room went still, the kind of stillness that held breath and regret. Huxley stopped and looked down, feigning surprise, then looked at Ethan with a smirk that invited response. "Careful where you park, dangerous animals," he said, voice oily with mock concern, eyes daring. Ethan didn't stand. He didn't argue. He reached down and rested his hand on Max's head, fingers spreading into the thick fur, feeling the controlled tension there, and lifted his eyes to Huxley with a calm so complete it unsettled the rhythm of the moment. "He's under the table," Ethan said evenly, his voice steady and uninflected, a statement rather than a defense. Huxley's smile tightened, the deputies shifting behind him, but the lack of reaction denied him the spark he wanted. And after a beat, he scoffed and moved on, boots thudding toward the counter where Sarah stiffened her shoulders, drawing in as if bracing for weather. He leaned too close to her, said something about cleanliness and inspections, when a fork clattered from a basket to the floor, his tone low and indulgent in its threat, and Sarah apologized too quickly, hands trembling as she bent to retrieve it. Ethan watched without moving the muscle in his jaw, flexing once before settling again. The officers ate without paying laughter, loud and unearned, then left as they had come, the bell jangling again, the door letting in a slice of gray light and cold. The diner exhaled in fragments, voices returning in cautious threads, and Sarah avoided Ethan's eyes as she wiped the counter, gratitude and fear warring there. Ethan finished his coffee after it had gone lukewarm, the taste bitter and grounding his gaze following the patrol car as it idled outside and pulled away, tires hissing over slush. He held the mug a moment longer than necessary, fingers tightening around the ceramic as if testing its strength, then set it down with care. Max shifted beneath the table, pressing his shoulder against Ethan's shin, a silent question and answer in one. Ethan's decision arrived without ceremony, without drama, settling into him, with the certainty of something he had done before and would do again. He rose, paid in cash, nodded once to Sarah, and stepped back into the cold, watching the road where the patrol car disappeared. He did not leave town that morning. Snow returned overnight, soft and deceptive, whitening the town, until it looked cleansed, as if nothing bad could survive beneath that pale cover. Ethan Cole stayed. He rented a small, aging cabin on the outskirts of town, where the paved road surrendered to packed snow and tall pines leaned inward like quiet sentries. The cabin was built decades earlier, single-story cedar, planked and weather-beaten, with a stone chimney darkened by years of smoke and neglect. Inside it smelled faintly of old wood dust and cold iron. The furniture was sparse and mismatched, the kind left behind by people who never planned to return, but the place offered what Ethan needed most: isolation, clear sightlines, and silence deep enough to think. Each morning he pulled on the same clothes, the worn brown leather jacket, red and navy flannel faded jeans, heavy boots, gray scarf, and stepped back into town with Max at his side. Max moved through the snow with effortless balance, his thick coat insulating him from the cold, his tail low, and controlled his amber eyes, scanning constantly. At 4 years old, Max was in his prime muscles, hard beneath his fur, his presence both reassuring and unmistakably alert, the kind of dog that made people straighten unconsciously when he passed. Ethan walked slowly, never in a hurry, absorbing the rhythms of the place. He learned which shops opened early and which stayed dark until late afternoon, which streets the patrol cars favored, and which alleys never seemed to see daylight. The town looked picturesque under snow brick storefronts trimmed with white old lampposts wrapped in frost, but beneath that surface lay tension so ingrained it had become habit. People watched him with guarded curiosity, their eyes flicking first to his face, then to Max, then quickly away, measuring whether acknowledging him was safe. The first person to speak freely was Arthur Bell, an elderly man Ethan met on a park bench near the frozen creek that cut through town. Arthur was well into his 70s, tall once, but now stooped, his frame thin and angular under a heavy wool coat that swallowed him. His hands shook slightly from age, and old injuries, his skin weathered and pale. But his eyes were sharp steel blue, and unafraid, the eyes of someone who had seen worse than small-town bullies. Arthur had served decades earlier, something about him unmistakably military, despite the years, and he talked with the careful precision of a man who chose words the way others chose tools. He spoke quietly, not looking directly at Ethan, as if the wind itself might be listening, and confirmed what Ethan already suspected. Traffic stops that ended in cash payments slipped into pockets, businesses forced to contribute monthly fees for protection they neither wanted nor received, and a pattern of residents who questioned authority only to sell their homes suddenly or vanish altogether. Arthur's voice never shook when he said it, but his jaw tightened, and Ethan recognized the restraint of anger long managed rather than cured. From Arthur, Ethan learned names and routines, heard about Officer Brian Huxley's reach and the deputies who followed him, men who wore badges like shields rather than responsibilities. Other conversations followed, always brief, always cautious. A hardware store owner named Frank Dalton, broad-backed and thick-bearded, spoke while pretending to reorganize shelves, his voice rough and resentful as he described paying fines without paperwork. A woman named Linda Park, owner of a small laundromat, slim with tired eyes and prematurely gray hair, admitted in a whisper that she'd stopped reporting vandalism years ago after a patrol car parked outside her shop for hours the last time she complained. Each story layered onto the last building a picture of control maintained not by overt violence, but by constant pressure, by making resistance feel pointless and dangerous. Ethan listened more than he spoke, nodding only when necessary, his face giving away nothing. Inside, his thoughts moved with deliberate clarity, cataloging patterns, weighing risk, feeling an old, familiar shift as observation replaced instinctive avoidance. At night, the cabin glowed longer than the rest of the forest, a single rectangle of warm light amid the trees. Ethan cleaned and organized with methodical care, unpacking only what he needed, his movements economical, habitual. He brushed Max's coat each evening, checking paws for ice cuts, running his hands along the dog's shoulders and ribs, feeling for tension. Max leaned into the contact ears, relaxing briefly before lifting again, attuned to every sound outside. This was not affection for comfort's sake. It was maintenance, communication, reassurance exchanged without words. When the wind picked up and the trees creaked, Ethan stood at the window watching the faint tracks of passing vehicles on the distant road, his reflection superimposed over the darkness. He remembered other places where staying had been the most dangerous option, and also the only one that made sense. The town slept under its blanket of snow, but Ethan did not. He walked its edges in the evenings, boots crunching softly, Max pacing in step, learning where light fell and where it didn't. He noted a patrol car that lingered too long behind certain buildings, another that never seemed to venture near the industrial lots. He never crossed lines or tested boundaries yet. He simply learned them, By the third day, his presence had become familiar enough to be tolerated but not trusted, and that was exactly where he wanted to be. The people who talked to him did so with eyes lowered, shoulders tight, as if even sharing truth carried consequence. Ethan carried those confessions back to the cabin, letting them settle alongside his own memories, feeling the weight of a decision deepen rather than resolve. Max slept lightly near the doorhead on his paws, ready to rise at the smallest change in the night air. Ethan sat at the small table lamp, casting long shadows on the walls, his hands wrapped around a mug he barely tasted from, and understood fully now that this town was not broken by accident, but shaped deliberately. The snow outside reflected moonlight, bright and blinding, and for a moment the place looked almost innocent. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and accepted what staying truly meant, knowing that once he moved beyond observation, there would be no clean way back. The snow stopped falling, and the nights turned clear and brutally cold, moonlight hardening every shadow and stripping the town to its bones. Ethan Cole watched without being seen. He moved through his days as before, the brown leather jacket creaking softly with each step, the red and navy flannel muted beneath it, boots crunching on frozen gravel. Gray scarf tucked high against the wind, his face composed and unreadable. Inside, however, a different current ran, focused, disciplined, patient, an old internal switch, set firmly to observe rather than react. He did not confront Officer Brian Huxley or the deputies who trailed him like reflections. He did not argue with shopkeepers or warn the frightened. He simply listened and remembered. Faces became coordinates, habits became maps, and license plates etched themselves into memory, alongside times and routes. Max mirrored him perfectly, the German Shepherd's movements measured and silent, 4 years old, and all muscle and awareness, his black and tan coat absorbing the darkness, amber eyes catching the smallest motion. When Ethan paused, Max paused. When Ethan turned his head, Max's ears adjusted a fraction, the two bound by trust refined into efficiency. After sunset, when the town's windows went dark and the last car hissed past on the main road, Ethan and Max slipped into the pine forest that ringed the outskirts, the air there resinous and sharp, the ground packed hard beneath old snow. The cabin light went out early on purpose, and anyone glancing from town would have assumed the stranger slept like everyone else. Instead, Ethan followed the margins, staying where the forest thinned, and the industrial lots began where the town's true habits surfaced. He stood in shadows and let time stretch, letting the cold seep through leather and wool until it became background noise, his breathing slow and controlled. Max stayed low and close, tail-still paws placed with surgical care, a presence that did not disturb the night. From a distance, Ethan watched patrol cars idle behind closed businesses, engines ticking softly, headlights dark. He noted how long they lingered, and how often they returned, how drivers approached those cars with shoulders hunched and wallets ready, how conversations happened at windows and ended without paperwork. Once from behind a chain-link fence crusted with ice, Ethan saw a transaction that lasted less than a minute. A nervous man in his 30s with a knit cap pulled low-skinned sallow under fluorescent spill, handing folded bills to a deputy whose face Ethan had already catalogued. The deputy laughed, clapped the man on the shoulder too hard, and drove off without logging a thing. Ethan did not move, did not judge in the moment. He fixed the image and the timing and let it sink into place. Another night brought a different scene near the old rail spur, a tow truck easing in with its lights off, driven by a wiry mechanic named Leo Kramer, a man in his 40s with oil-blackened hands, a narrow face shaved too close, and eyes that darted as if expecting impact. Leo moved fast and spoke faster, his body language betraying a life spent negotiating margins and he handed something small and heavy through a cruiser window to one of Huxley's deputies, before rolling away. Ethan recognized the posture of guilt and the choreography of comfort between men who believed themselves untouchable. He did not intervene. He documented the rhythm in his head, aware that the town would wake tomorrow unchanged and none the wiser. Back in daylight, Ethan walked Main Street with Max at heel, nodding to Sarah at the diner as she refilled cups. Her chestnut hair pulled back, her freckles stark against pale winter skin, the kindness in her eyes dulled by fatigue. She said little, but her shoulders eased when Max lay down quietly beneath a table, the dog's discipline offering a strange reassurance. Arthur Bell passed them near the frozen creek cane, tapping his steel-blue eyes sharp under a knit cap, and said nothing beyond a brief greeting, but the set of his jaw told Ethan the older man sensed movement beneath the surface. Even Frank Dalton's hardware store seemed to breathe differently, Frank's thick beard hiding a grim half-smile as he rang up nails and rope, his broad hand steady despite the anger that lived there. Linda Park watched from behind the glass of her laundromat, slim frame tense, prematurely gray hair tucked beneath a wool hat, fear and hope warring in her gaze as Ethan passed. Each day added weight, each night added clarity, and the space between observation and action narrowed by degrees too small to measure, but impossible to ignore. In the cabin, Ethan spread nothing out, wrote nothing down, left no physical trace of his thinking. He cleaned his boots, brushed Max's coat, checked the dog's paws, and sat at the small table with the lamp low, eyes unfocused, as he replayed scenes in precise sequence. He knew better than to rush. He also knew the cost of waiting too long. Max sensed the change before Ethan acknowledged it fully, the dog's sleep lighter. Now head lifting at distant sounds, body aligning toward the door when engines passed on the far road. On one clear night, with the stars sharp and the temperature biting, Ethan followed a patrol car farther than before, keeping distance through tree lines and abandoned yards, never crossing into light. The car stopped behind a closed diner on the edge of town, the same diner where Sarah worked by day, and Ethan felt a tightening in his chest he refused to name. Two figures approached the cruiser, voices low and hurried, and the exchange ended with laughter that carried farther than it should have. Ethan memorized the cadence the way laughter masked threat, and let the car pull away before he and Max melted back into the forest. He returned to the cabin just before dawn, breath-fogging fingers stiff, the decision settling deeper rather than resolving. He understood now that what he was witnessing was not chaos, but a system tuned to exploit silence, and that systems did not break from anger alone. As the first light crept through the pines, Ethan stood by the window watching frost glow on needles, and accepted that the nights without snow had given him what he needed, a complete picture drawn in shadow, every wrong turn recorded in memory waiting. Sunday morning broke clear and sharp, the cold rinsed clean by a pale sun that glinted off snowmelt and glass. The diner filled early, every booth occupied, voices layered with the clink of plates and the hiss of the griddle, a weekly ritual that felt almost normal if one ignored the tension coiled beneath it. Ethan Cole arrived on foot, 45 broad-shouldered without bulk, wearing the same dark brown leather jacket creased at the elbows, the red and navy flannel beneath faded jeans, cold-weather boots, and a gray wool scarf tucked high. He moved with deliberate calm, Max pacing at his heel, with the disciplined trot of a working dog. Max's black and tan coat gleamed from careful brushing amber eyes, alert but soft, 4 years old, and fully grown, his presence grounding and unmistakably controlled. Ethan did not scan the room theatrically. He already knew it. He went straight to the large round table by the window, the one no one used on Sundays, the one kept empty by habit and fear, and pulled out a chair. The scrape of wood on tile cut across conversation like a blade. He adjusted his scarf, and placed his hands flat on the table. Max settled beneath body aligned to the door chin, down ears half lifted. Sarah noticed first. She was tall and slim, chestnut hair tied back, freckles bright against pale skin, her eyes widening a fraction before she recovered. She crossed the floor with coffee and forced a smile that trembled at the edges. "Morning," she said softly, setting a mug down as if normalcy could be willed into place. Ethan ordered eggs and toast in an even tone, asked for water for Max, nothing more. Around them, conversations stuttered, and then died, replaced by the quiet rustle of coats and the scrape of silverware. Arthur Bell sat 2 tables over with other older men, his stooped frame straightening as he took in the scene. Steel blue eyes sharp under his knit cap, his cane resting against his knee. Frank Dalton stood near the counter waiting for a refill, thick beard bristling as his jaw set, while Linda Park hovered by the door with a cup clutched in both hands, slim shoulders, tight gaze fixed on Ethan with something like hope, edged by dread. The door swung open at 10 on the dot. Officer Brian Huxley entered with his deputies, uniform stretched across his heavy frame, face-flushed eyes already hunting. He stopped mid-step when he saw Ethan at the window table. The pause was small, but unmistakable. A hitch in a man used to obedience. Huxley's smile arrived late and mean. He crossed the room with purpose boots, thudding deputies flanking him like shadows. "That seat's taken?" he said, baton tapping the table in a hollow rhythm meant to command. Ethan finished a bite, wiped his mouth, and looked up with an expression devoid of challenge or apology. "It was empty," he replied, voice level. The word hung there, daring interpretation. Huxley's eyes flicked to Max beneath the table, then back to Ethan. "Animals don't belong where decent folks eat," Huxley said, leaning in, breath sharp with coffee. Ethan's hand slid down to rest on Max's neck, fingers spreading into fur, a silent exchange of restraint. "He's under the table," Ethan said again, as if reciting a fact. The deputy on Huxley's right, young, lean, eager, shifted his weight and smiled thinly, and that was when it happened. He stepped closer and drove his boot under the table in a sudden, vicious kick aimed at Max's ribs. The impact thudded. Max snarled low teeth, flashing white muscles coiling in an instant, a sound that vibrated through the floor and into the bones of everyone nearby. Chairs scraped back. A woman gasped. Arthur Bell surged to his feet, cane clattering anger overriding age as he reached out. "That's enough," he barked. Voice cracked but strong. Huxley shoved him aside without looking, a heavy arm, swinging with casual force. Arthur fell hard against the booth edge and slid to the floor, breath knocked out of him. The room erupted into shouts, and then froze again as Huxley's hand went to his belt. Ethan moved. It took seconds. He rose in one fluid motion, body angling between Max and the deputy, his left hand clamping the man's wrist as the right drove into the elbow, turning momentum into collapse. The deputy yelped and dropped baton, skittering away. Ethan pivoted, using Huxley's forward surge against him, a controlled sweep that sent the larger man sprawling onto the tile face, red with shock, breath rushing out in a wet grunt. Max remained under the table, muscles taut, eyes locked, obeying the single quiet command Ethan gave without raising his voice. Guns cleared leather. The black mouths of pistols aimed center mass. The diner held its breath. Ethan froze deliberately, hands open, posture tall. He looked at Sarah, who stood pale and shaking behind the counter, at Arthur, struggling to sit up, at Frank's clenched fists, at Linda's white knuckles. He released Huxley and stepped back, palms out. "I'm done," he said loud enough for all to hear. "I'm complying." Huxley scrambled to his feet, rage and humiliation twisting his features. "Cuff him!" he barked, spittle flying. The deputies moved fast now, adrenaline covering fear metal snapping tight around Ethan's wrists as they shoved him toward the door. Max growled once, a warning then stilled at Ethan's look. Sarah dropped a tray. It shattered. Arthur called Ethan's name hoarse. No one stopped them. The bell rang as the door opened, winter light flooding in, and Ethan was marched past the windows where the town watched, stunned and silent. Outside, the patrol car idled. Ethan was pushed into the back seat, the door slamming shut with finality. Through the glass, he saw Max, held by a deputy, the dog straining once before settling eyes never leaving him. The car pulled away, tires hissing on wet pavement, and the diner receded the empty table by the window, visible for a heartbeat longer than it should have been. Morning arrived with a thaw, thin sunlight loosening winter's grip, water dripping from eaves, and the air carrying the clean mineral smell of melting snow. The police station looked unchanged from the outside, brick squat and practical, but inside the balance had already shifted. Ethan Cole sat cuffed at a metal table in a windowless room. Shoulders relaxed posture, upright, brown leather jacket creased, where the restraints pressed gray scarf folded neatly on the chair beside him. He breathed slowly, feeling the old calm settle the kind that arrived when a plan moved beyond the point of reversal. Officer Brian Huxley paced across from him, face flushed and jaw tight, his confidence brittle now, the deputies hovering with forced bravado. They spoke like winners, voices sharp, savoring the moment, unaware that the lines they believed protected them had already been crossed. Ethan listened, without reacting, eyes steady-mind, cataloging the cadence of their words, and the timing of the building itself, counting heartbeats the way he once counted steps in darker places. In a holding area down the hall, Max weighted the German shepherd's black and tan coat, catching the fluorescent light. Amber eyes calm but intent, 4 years old, and perfectly still, his presence a quiet promise that Ethan was not alone. The moment came without ceremony. Tires rolled hard in the lot, engines unfamiliar and heavier than local patrols. Boots struck concrete with purpose, and voices cut through the station with a tone that brooked no argument. Captain Raymond Hale of the State Police entered first, tall and lean, with close-cropped gray hair and a face carved by years of discipline rather than indulgence, his uniform immaculate eyes assessing everything at once. Behind him came 2 federal agents in dark coats, adults in their 40s, with neutral expressions, and practiced restraint, the kind of people who carried authority without advertising it. The room changed temperature. Huxley's pacing stopped. Hale didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He asked for cameras, logs, names, and keys, and the answers arrived late and wrong. A laptop appeared on the table screen, glowing files opening with methodical inevitability. The agent spoke briefly, their words precise, and the evidence began to unfold, timestamps, aligned faces, clear transactions, captured patterns, undeniable. The deputy's shoulders sagged first. Huxley's followed bravado, collapsing into a hard, swallowing silence. Badges came off with soft, tearing sounds that carried farther than any shout. Ethan watched, face unreadable, not satisfied, not relieved, simply present as a system dismantled itself under the weight of its own record. When Hale turned to him, his gaze held respect rather than apology. "You're free to go," he said, and the cuffs came off. Ethan flexed his hands once the marks already fading and stood. He asked only for Max. Down the hall a door opened and the dog rose at once, tail still, eyes bright, moving to Ethan's side with controlled joy. Ethan knelt, ran his hands along Max's shoulders and ribs, checking grounding, whispering a wordless reassurance that steadied them both. By the time they stepped outside, the sun had climbed higher, the thaw quickening, and the town felt lighter without understanding why. Ethan did not linger. He drove straight to the diner. The lot was full in a different way now, family sedans and pickups instead of idling cruisers. Inside, the bell rang and did not hush the room. Plates clinked, laughter rose and fell naturally, and when people noticed Ethan, conversation didn't stop, it softened. Sarah stood behind the counter, tall and slim, chestnut hair, pulled back freckles, warm against skin, no longer drained by fear. She met his eyes and crossed the room without speaking her embrace, brief and fierce gratitude, heavy and unspoken. Arthur Bell stood from his table cane in hand, steel blue eyes, clear posture straighter than Ethan had ever seen it. Frank Dalton nodded once, thick beard hiding a smile, while Linda Park pressed a hand to her chest, shoulders easing as if a long-held breath had finally found release. Ethan took the same seat by the window, not because it belonged to him, but because it belonged to no one now. Max lay beneath the table, relaxed at last, head on pause, ears soft. No speeches followed. No applause. The town chose silence, and in that silence, something older and stronger than noise took root. Breakfast arrived, eggs toast, coffee ordinary and perfect. Ethan ate slowly, tasting warmth and normalcy, watching sunlight crawl across the floor where steam rose from melting slush, tracked in by boots that no longer hurried. When he finished, he stood paid in cash and declined the pie Sarah tried to press on him with a gentle shake of his head and a smile that reached his eyes. Outside, the thaw continued, water dripping in steady rhythms, the sky widening. People gathered without coordination. Arthur, Sarah, Frank, Linda, others, whose names Ethan never learned, and they stood as he reached his truck. Arthur raised his hand in a salute made careful by age but exact in its meaning. Others bowed their heads or placed hands over hearts. Ethan returned the salute, once crisp and brief, then opened the door. Max leapt into the passenger seat, tail thumping once before settling eyes forward. The engine turned over. Ethan pulled onto the road and did not look back. The town breathed, and for the first time in a long while it did so without fear. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly through patience, restraint, and the courage to do what is right when no one is watching. This story reminds us that evil often survives on silence, but goodness grows when even one person chooses to stand firm with integrity. Perhaps that strength doesn't come from ourselves alone. Perhaps it is guided by something higher, by God's unseen hand, placing the right person in the right place at the right time. In our daily lives, we may not face corrupt systems or open injustice, but we face choices to stay silent or to act with kindness, to turn away or to protect the vulnerable. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment to tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to support stories that uplift the soul. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and grant you the courage to walk in truth. Amen.